Debbie, to just get kind of sense of the culture and background, and we'll start at the beginning. Can you tell me what exactly is the manosphere and how did you become interested in researching it?
So, yeah, of course, the manosphere is a kind of loose network or ecosystem of online groups that are united by their anti-feminist beliefs. Some would say also deeply misogynist beliefs, but there's kind of gradients, and they're all quite different, and they all have quite different agendas. And in some ways, they're a continuation of pre-internet men's rights groups, but in other ways, they're very different. And I suppose what drew me to researching the manosphere, which I've been researching for 10 years now, almost 10 years, um, was that I was previously interested in anti-feminist men's rights, as in pre-internet. And but in those days, I was more kind of looking at media representations of masculinity and ideas about masculinity in crisis. So I started looking at all of the anti-feminist men's rights groups in the States, in the UK. In Ireland, it was just John Waters, really, um, who was uh, the anti-feminist men's rights campaigner. Um, but I kind of followed them online, I suppose. I was interested to see around the time of Gamergate, what was happening. It was a very American phenomenon. A lot of the big groups pre-internet were American as well. And it was really interesting to see how the whole kind of tone and texture and rhetoric and even the interests of men's rights seemed to shift when they went online. And it became much more kind of personalized. It became much more individualistic in terms of like ways of doing politics. Um, and the most striking, I suppose, feature of it was its misogyny, direct, um, really, extreme attacks on women, including individual women, kind of hate campaigns against individual women. And this really hadn't been the modus operandi of the men's rights movements before the internet.
Mm.
So I became interested as a media scholar, I suppose, in like the different platforms and what is it about the online environment that facilitates this kind of way of doing politics, if you could even call it doing politics. So that's how I got interested in the manosphere. And it was around the time of Gamergate, which was a targeted campaign against female gamers and female game developers and game critics. And in many ways, Gamergate was this very adolescent, gamery kind of attack on women, which was about getting women out of this quite nerdy gamer space, I suppose. But it changed the tone of internet politics and it kind of set the tone, I would say, for the culture wars that were to ensue. In terms of it's not really about debate anymore, it's about winning. There's any winners and losers. It's kind of like the language of war, and you'll use any tactics necessary to win. It's not actually about arguing or listening or changing your mind. And that really has been, the tone and the nature of the culture wars ever since. It's, very polarized. And it polarized gender politics, basically. So
Yeah.
that's how I started following the different groups of the manosphere. And I did, I think, what was the first qualitative analysis of those different groups, kind of mapping them, seeing what they call themselves, what their agendas were, what they were trying, fighting for, how they disagreed with each other, etc. So it has obviously changed hugely in the last 10 years.
Yeah. Well, maybe to illustrate kind of for the audience who might not be aware of how prevalent it is now, and how social media algorithms and, the echo chamber of being online kind of is what we could possibly do is touch briefly on a study that you did last year with let me see, the Anti-Bullying Center. You completed it with doctors Baker and Anderson, which concluded that a newly created TikTok account that identified as male was shown toxic and misogynistic content within just 23 minutes of existing. And then after just 400 minutes of total viewing, most of the content shown was toxic. So like given that sort of ramping up in how prevalent this toxic culture is online, how urgent do you think it is kind of to bring the issue to the public now?
I think it's pretty urgent. There's always a danger, I suppose, of further proliferating these groups because they have been picked up by journalists, and there's quite a lot of documentaries and podcasts about them. So you don't want to kind of promote them, obviously, inadvertently. But I do think it's very important to make teachers are quite aware of this already, but to make parents aware of, the way in which this works. Because 23 minutes was one of the accounts, but there was another one that got offered this content after 2 minutes. So the algorithms, as soon as they realized that the fake accounts were male, started really fire hosing them with it was Andrew Tate at the time. That's, he's not the influencer who's in fashion at the moment. And, most of the boys we were talking to now are saying, oh, the Tates are like, are they not in prison? They haven't even heard about Trump flying them to Florida or whatever. They're into, they've moved on because there's loads of different types of masculinity influencers now. So some of are kind of Tate imitators, but there's lots of more kind of subtle ones, if you like, that are talking about how to make money, mental health, physical fitness, dating advice that's, not overtly sexist and stuff. So that, it's kind of expanding all the time. Um, so yeah, I mean, it is really important now, I think, as it was before, to instill a sense of kind of critical literacy among
Mm.
boys because their messaging is becoming so much more subtle. And, lots of the teenage boys we're talking to are saying, but that's good advice. Like they're all, they're giving us good advice about how to make money. They're giving us good advice about how to eat healthily and stay fit or whatever. And, you can, yeah, and they don't necessarily see the more subtle messaging about, that has this kind of misogynist or even um sometimes far right adjacent or conspiracy theory adjacent kind of undertones that are going on in a lot of this content, which is really problematic. I mean, of course, the idea alone that you can just sign up to some kind of pyramid scheme and make loads of money is a lie. Obviously, these guys are absolute grifters, most of them. But even the advice that if you get up every morning and you work hard, you're going to make money. I mean, it's like, lads, this is not how capitalism works. Look around you. Loads of people work really hard and don't get rich. That's what, capitalism is as a system. So it's like trying to equip them with I suppose, the digital literacy skills that they need to be
Mm.
able to kind of query those messages rather than just think in these very individualistic terms, which is this guy's telling me how to get rich, so he must be a good guy.
Mm.
Um, and that's really problematic. This kind of, I think, the shift towards individualism, individual problems, individual solutions, rather than seeing these things as social problems.
Yeah, no, 100%. Well, I think it's become, I think, a bit of a button issue this year because of shows like Adolescence or EastEnders have done, I think, a bit of a storyline on it, although I didn't see that one. Do you
They
think,
called me about that actually.
oh, really?
So they rang loads and loads, and people I know, loads of academics in the UK as well, to get, just it was well researched, obviously, because they were ringing around getting advice from, manosphere experts, incel experts. So I haven't actually watched it, but I've heard it's quite good.
I mean, the soaps have a really good history, don't they, of taking issues like domestic
Mhm.
violence or race issues or sexuality things and bringing them to the forefront in front of an audience who might not necessarily have experience with that before. So like it's really good to see that it's, starting to get out there. I know that especially around the time that adolescence came out, it was finally spoken about, like in the UK Parliament. It had a little bit of a moment, and it's being called now what a public health crisis here
Mm.
is the phrasing that's been thrown around. So I wonder, obviously, shows like that do sensationalize a little bit, but I wonder from your experience what, how accurately they kind of capture the digital pressures that especially young men face when they're, with their friends or with their peer groups engaging in these sorts of cultures and practices.
I think they captured the kind of peer group dynamic really well. Um, which is and also the kind of the fact that the algorithms are feeding this stuff to you. You're obviously talking about it in your peer group. It's infecting your language and your understanding of the world. So I think they captured that well. I think there's there's a load of kind of holes that they left open for misinterpretation.
Mm.
And you could see journalists and various other commentators did misinterpret, I think, some of the show's messages. So, I mean, this was already happening, but the incel ideology and incels were becoming conflated with the manosphere and masculinity influencers. And, they're very different groups within the manosphere. So the Andrew Tates and these like really toxic kind of masculinity influencers are quite a new phenomenon, and they've come out of the mainstreaming and commercialization of the manosphere, which has been really largely facilitated by TikTok. I
Mhm.
mean, this all happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, and when TikTok, um, came on the scene and really, kind of amplified influencer culture, all kinds of influencers, but particularly these kinds of toxic influencers. And that's when Andrew Tate kind of rose to fame, and his videos reached like 12, what had 12 billion views or something, like insane kind of impact and reach. And people suddenly realize, wow, this platform has incredible reach. And similar platforms like YouTube Shorts, which imitate TikTok, and the short video format, which is driven by algorithms, just amplifies ideas,
Mhm.
incredibly quickly. And a lot of people obviously, copped onto this and started using it. So, that's a kind of very commercialized end of the manosphere, whereas the manosphere 10 years ago was very subterranean, it was very subcultural. It was like really weird image board subcultures like 4chan, 4chan B, 4chan Paul, which are, most people don't have anything to do with, and they're quite adolescent. There's a lot of like weird pornography, and it's just a very transgressive, weird space. This is where Pepe the Frog and all of that kind of alt-right um, meme culture originated as well. So it was a much more kind of anti-feminist, political, not commercial at all culture. And
Yeah.
it was much kind of nerdier, much more adolescent. Um, and there were lots of other groups of the manosphere, like men going their own way and pickup artists. And it was really pickup artists, men who taught other men how to seduce women. They were the precursors of male supremacist influencers. Incels are very much like a closed group. They, they hang out in very closed platforms like incels.is. They don't really, and they all have similar views and ideologies about dating and women, etc. But they're a very different kind of subgroup of the internet. Um, and incels are involuntary celibates. They're men who, don't have any success sexually. Um, they feel that this is because they are losers in the genetic lottery. Um, but by birth, because of how they look, because they're too short, because they don't have strong jawlines, because they all buy into this idea of alpha males and, you know, evolutionary psychology that women are only attracted to alpha males, but only 20% of the population is alpha male.
Hmm.
And, they're not even beta males, they're incels. Like they see themselves as at the bottom of the heap. So they're very angry and they're usually quite socially isolated men. They are not the kinds of guys that Andrew Tate and Aidan Ross and Sneeko and all of these masculinity influencers appeal to. Those influencers appeal to kind of much more laddish mainstream masculinities. So I think the show kind of conflated these because at one point, Katie, I think it's Katie, called Jamie an incel,
Mm.
insult. And I think people thought, oh, he's involved in the incel community. But I don't think he was. I think he was much more exposed to the kind of Andrew Tate stuff,
Mm.
if that
Fair.
makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think we had this discussion before this meeting as well, where we were kind of saying which direction were we going to kind of put it into to
Mm.
give the best overview of this. So like even though I've, done my own master's thesis on this same topic, I conflated the two. So I, was kind of interchangeably using incel and manosphere. So it makes perfect sense that, if you're not like really, really involved in the academia of it, you could feel how it could be like conflated easily.
Sure,
So
yeah.
that makes sense. I think we probably couldn't have this chat and not touch on the whole podcast bros, though, even
Mm.
though they're not necessarily connecting with, teens and young adults. But I think well, where a lot of people find their kind of entry point to this is with being red pilled, with being exposed to a short on TikTok of a podcast where someone's saying, talking about the male loneliness epidemic, or some of the other talking points that I've been exposed to are, you were sold poison chalice to men, for example, that you were told, your parents told you it should be you get the wife, the kids, the house, the car, the dog, but that's not available to them anymore. So when they're in this space of, you know, feeling rejected or lonely, they can then kind of find a community in this group.
Mhm.
So I think do you think that these kind of emotional and cultural drivers are specifically targeting young men as a point of, a grift for money? Or do you think that some of them actually do really genuinely believe what they're saying?
I think it's both. I think mostly it's driven by money, but behind them,
Mm,
for the last 10 years, there have been organizations that are feeding and amplifying these ideas that are
mm,
genuinely politically committed to these ideas as well. They're also quite linked to the far right.
mm,
They overlap with a lot of conspiracy theories. I mean, the far right has a vested interest in returning women to the home. And this idea now we're seeing through influencers who are trad wives.
mm,
And so that's being fed just as like the Andrew Tate kinds of content is being served to younger men, younger women are receiving, quite a lot of trad wife content. And if you don't really understand the broader political context of the culture wars or the history of feminism and anti-feminism, some of this content appears to be quite like neutral, ostensibly kind of harmless. Um, it's just white women baking cakes and, feeding their chickens and, this kind of idyllic rural kind of life. But of course, it's all part of this bigger kind of messaging about getting women back into the home, which is a big part of the far right agenda, obviously. So they overlap in really interesting ways. They overlap on kind of anti-immigration points as well, like the threat to Western civilization, white men, etc. So yeah, um, I can't remember what your initial question was.
I was basically
Oh,
just saying that, is it a grift for money specifically, or
oh
is
yeah,
it,
yeah.
is it a genuine
It's
belief in
both.
it? I think, yeah, I
It's
think if you
both, but I think increasingly you're seeing like since the Tates, you're seeing these other guys who are really similar. You know, every country now has their version of Andrew Tate. There's Amadeo Llados in Spain. All the South American countries have a version. There's loads of French kind of versions of Andrew Tate. There's lots of black men as well. So it's not, well, Andrew Tate is by his own description, mixed race, but there's the black manosphere. It's diversifying. Um, he converted to Islam. Sneeko converted to Islam. Like these are really cynical moves to try, even though they have, a whole lot of anti-immigration rhetoric. These are really kind of cynical moves to appeal to much bigger audiences as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So it is,
Patrick,
yeah, it's
sorry.
hugely commercially driven, and they're really ostensibly into showing off their wealth.
Mhm. Well, yeah, they need something for people to strive for, don't they, and watch them for. Patrick made a good point there to just we can watch our jargon and make sure that if we're saying things like red pill, we should explain a little bit what they are. Sorry about
Mm,
that, Pat. But yeah, I think when it comes to you mentioned there the tradwife thing, and I don't know if you know, there's a creator called Ballerina Farm.
yeah,
She I came across one of her videos and she was, as you said, baking bread with her 9 children, or however many there are. She's in this beautiful house. They're on a ranch, they have 1,000 cows, they milk the cows every morning, all this beautiful, wonderful, idyllic, and you're like, oh, I've got my 9 to 5, it's raining, I'd really love to be there. And then you realize the stove behind her is $25,000. Then you realize that her husband is a Boeing heir. Then you think, hang on now, she's filming this content, she's putting it up on the internet, she's editing it, doing voiceovers, she's working. She's
yeah,
actually doing a job. She's not actually just baking bread. She's doing all the things to get that content in front of people and then using it to now, I believe she's selling chopping boards for $300 or something. So it's become, a money-making thing for her as well. But so many people in her comments say things like, this is the life I strive for. This is the life I'd love. Take me back to when
mm,
this was the way of it. And you can see how these these influencers just insidiously get inside people's minds.
yeah. And they know exactly how to do it because they're tapping into all of the insecurities and the vulnerabilities that capitalism causes, basically, and the kind of social isolation that people feel. Um,
Mhm.
and it's like, why should I do this like 9 to 5 job in a factory and live in you know, a for rent apartment that I can never buy? This is my life now, like completely isolated, moving maybe from country to country as an economic migrant. You can see how this would really appeal to a lot of people. It just looks like a beautiful life when you just get out of bed and you have this fabulous life. And so the far right is really promoting this kind of
Mhm.
imagery to women in particular. I mean, as well as promoting different kinds of imagery to men. Um, but yeah, I mean, these are business women, paradoxically, like they're running huge businesses. I did a podcast with the Irish Times about it actually a couple of years ago with Roisin Ingle. Um, or not, well, it was her show, but laughing about this idea that you're selling women the idea of domesticity as the dream when you've actually built this massive business.
Mhm.
Um, and they have employees, it's a full studio set, you know, these kitchens and these homes. So yeah, I mean, influencer culture.
Mhm.
What can you say? I mean, it's just the influencer economy is just so hard to wrap your head around if you've grown up working, in a pre-internet job and a pre-internet economy. It's kind of
Absolutely.
mad what people will do for clicks and for likes.
Well, I think there's another question alongside all of that, and it kind of comes back to the manosphere exposure and this as well to girls. Like, do we know how this kind of content is affecting their relationship forming in the real world? Like, do we have kind of studies yet that are seeing how young people are coming away from that exposure and interacting with each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some evidence from teachers, from interviews, that people have done with boys. Um, there was a survey done by Women's Aid in the UK just last year, which was it's hard always to prove causation,
Hmm.
but we can show correlation. So, people who've been exposed to a lot of masculinity influencer content were more likely, for example, to have sexist attitudes. But you don't know which caused which, right? It could be just guys with more sexist attitudes are drawn to Andrew Tate. Um, People who had watched a lot of this kind of content were more likely to say that it was okay to inflict physical violence on somebody. So they had a load of these kinds of indicators which showed quite a strong correlation. But the other thing I think that's important to remember is that they're not just watching um, male supremacist influencers and bits of far right stuff in isolation. They're also being fed a lot of conspiracy stuff, a lot of anti-trans stuff. And there's a whole pile of other stuff that forms the backdrop to the kind of constant wallpaper that they're engaging in. And pornography is one of those as well. So it's very difficult to say, is this because you have been consuming massive amounts of a particular type of influencer, that's pushing very aggressive masculinity, or is this because you also watch a lot of pornography and people themselves don't know because
Mm.
we're unconscious of the effects that media has on us. Most people will say that it doesn't affect them, but it does affect other people. Like that's a constant refrain, which is advertising doesn't affect me, my internet use doesn't affect me, but I'd be worried about my younger sibling or. So they do acknowledge it affects people, but it never affects the people that you're
Mm.
interviewing, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, I mean, there's so many other factors,
Mm.
family life, all of the other stuff they're consuming, their peer cultures, etc., that it's very difficult to pull out one thing and to establish a very clear relationship. But certainly teachers are reporting that this is a major problem in the classroom and that a lot of their male students feel quite emboldened to shout out sexist comments, to be disrespectful to them, to say they don't respect the views of female teachers, that they want a male teacher instead, this kind of stuff. So it is definitely having an impact for sure.
Yeah, I actually saw a great talk you did a couple of weeks ago in Galway at the oh, what festival was it?
Oh, the Galway Arts Festival
At
in
Arts
it
Festival,
was
that's
in
what it
summer,
was.
yeah.
Yeah, I saw that wonderful panel that you did where, and I'll just trigger warning it. I won't say anything too bad, but I'll just discuss pornography for a minute. Where you kind of got onto the topic of how younger people were being exposed to a more extreme porn and started feeling like they were more required to participate in more extreme sexual acts younger.
Mm.
And I believe there was a statistic that one of your co-panelists mentioned, which don't quote me on it because I didn't write it down. It was that now choking is one of the highest rates of girls being admitted into the ER.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the statistic. It was probably Owen Cleary.
It was,
And
it was. I wish I'd written it down, but it was basically that now choking as the example that was used is so prevalent in young people kind of getting to know each other in that way that it's actually sending children into the hospital because obviously it's not a safe thing to be doing really at all.
yeah,
Um, but because they're being exposed to that. So I suppose when we're talking about this sort of content and why it's so important, there's this whole world that children are being kind of adultified so young, that it's not surprising to me that you're finding, that kids are being disrespectful to teachers because they're doing a lot worse with each other.
yeah, that's true. Um, I think Women's Aid did a study a couple of years ago on Irish people's attitudes to pornography. Since then, the SERP Institute, which used to be based in UCD, but has now, I think, set up independently, has done a lot of research with young people, and looking at talking to doctors as well and psychologists, etc., about these kinds of things. So yeah, there is definitely increasing rates of girls and women feeling pressured to do these kinds of things, and pretty alarming statistics about yeah, non-consensual strangulation. The rates of that are quite alarming in Ireland, in the UK, everywhere. In Australia as well. So there's been a lot of reports that are showing how prevalent this is becoming.
Mm,
And a lot of this porn is free. A lot of the free porn has really alarming levels of sexual violence, is very misogynistic. And it's really easy for them to access it. So, it's curiosity, obviously. And this is kind of where they're learning these
mm,
kinds of sexual scripts. I don't think they feel good about it themselves. I think they're very conflicted. They don't know, is this like what girls want? They think it's what girls want. Girls think it's what boys want. There's no communication because they haven't been taught how to communicate about this kind of stuff. So, there's a kind of a void in the sex ed program about, these kinds of conversations. And then there's like huge pushback if you try to introduce any kind of porn literacy in schools from the far right. Suddenly you know, trying to indoctrinate children with pornography, which is, of course, you're trying to do exactly the opposite. Um, so it's a really, really tricky subject. Owen Cleary is kind of the guy. I was on the online health task force with him, and he's a teacher in Temple Carrick and Greystones, and he's had some really, like, he talks to his students, or they talk to him, about the kinds of stuff that they see and watch, and the impact that it has on them. And he's just started a PhD, I think it's a PhD project with Ruth Breslin, from SERP, which will be interviewing young people, about their experiences and how this is impacting them. But it's, yeah, no, it is definitely a real issue.
yeah. Well, I think, we kind of talked about how it all works and, what the overall kind of um, culture of the internet looks like at the moment in regards to this radicalization and manosphere and stuff. I think what it would be nice to do for our last kind of 20 minutes, half an hour is to kind of connect it back a little bit. So obviously with humanism, we would emphasize, dignity and compassion and understanding, which I
Mhm.
suppose is the complete antithesis of this kind of culture. So I think it's a hard thing to have compassion and understanding for people whose beliefs are harmful or potentially kind of violent, or, would, you know, believing that someone has the right to exist in the world however they want to, while they don't believe that you do.
Mm.
That's a very difficult line to take. But what I'd like to maybe do is discuss how you think that, educators, communities, maybe families could use these sorts of things like compassion and understanding or empathy to counter the hate effectively, like in the classroom or in their homes.
Yeah, I think it's essential. It's probably the core, um, way in which we can get, help support, boys and young men to reconnect with each other, because a lot of this really is a crisis of connection,
Mm,
um, where they have quite weak friendship networks. They seem like strong tie networks, but they're very laddish, and they don't actually seek support or help from each other or talk about feelings. Um, and so very often they are kind of emotionally alone and not very emotionally, literate. So I think teaching empathy or fostering empathy from a very young age is really the key, to this. And the first time a boy is told not to cry because boys don't cry is the beginning of it. That's the beginning where And people don't do this in bad faith. They do this because they've learned these gender norms because that's how they were brought up themselves. And they think, I don't want my son to be bullied, or I need my son to be strong. And so I have to teach him these norms, not to cry, and, to kind of be stoic and to bottle up his feelings because that's how he's going to survive in the world. Like, it's not done in bad faith. It's done in good faith most of the time, right? By individual people. But this is where the problem sets in, is that lack of empathy causes a lack of connection, a lack of deep connection. And um, this is where boys become more vulnerable,
Mm,
particularly after puberty, to indoctrination by what they see as very powerful male figures online, or it could be, pornography or gambling. But they're much more vulnerable to getting sucked in to quite extreme communities. It can be for a very short space of time and it's very easy to replace. But if there's nothing to replace it, that's the problem. So I think, ensuring that connection and empathy are fostered and not threatened from a very young age is absolutely essential. Um, Boys and girls and all genders playing together, being educated together, I think is is really important as well. Um, Diversity, fostering diversity and understanding for difference.
mm,
Um, so, that those are kind of philosophical approaches almost, I think, um, that we need to adopt in the education system, which would be quite a radical overhaul because, I'm not talking about philosophy as a subject, but philosophy as a tool of inquiry, and, opening up critical thinking. Because how else are we going to develop the kind of critical literacy that young people need to be able to look at something and say, that's not true? Like the boys in one of the schools last week were telling me that if you handle too many till receipts, it lowers your testosterone. And, they don't see the agenda behind this. This is like the manosphere, men's rights groups online saying men shouldn't be working in the service industry, men should be in the army, or men should be, the bosses or their own bosses or whatever, instead of wage slaves or brokies, as they call them. And this is what that's linked to, as far as I can see. The service industry is for women. So now the ink or some chemical in the paper, apparently, of handling till receipts lowers your testosterone. And I said, do you not think that's conspiracy theory? And they're like, no, no, no. I actually saw one of them's like, no, there's loads of conspiracy theories out there, but this one's true.
mm,
And I said, well, what research did you do to back that up? Like, where did you go to find? Oh, yeah, no, no, somebody sent around a scientific article showing that it's true. So they don't know how to verify that. I mean, they're only 14, these guys that I was talking to. So yeah, fair enough. But, you know, those kind of critical literacy skills are really important in schools because the messaging and the crazy stuff they're hearing, and then AI, of course, I have
mm,
to check to see if loads of things are AI or not because, it's just getting so sophisticated. And you're looking at these little cute videos with animals, and then you're thinking, oh my God, is that actually AI? Um, so it's like
mm,
it's crazy the kind of levels of disinformation and misinformation that are out there. So I think empathy is key.
mm,
Um, Philosophical kind of types of inquiry are key. In order to because once your connections are stronger, you can always ask your pals. You can, you've got something to fall back on. But it's isolation, I think, that is where it becomes very dangerous. Kids isolated in their bedrooms.
yeah.
We're
Well,
seeing that with
I,
AI chatbots. Teenage boys are kind of turning to AI girlfriends increasingly as well. Came out in a report last week in the UK, and it's quite prevalent. They're just talking to mental health chatbots that aren't qualified at all. I mean, this stuff is crazy. And girlfriends, and the girlfriends are like never disagree with them. It's like so you're not learning any boundaries. So yeah, media literacy, um, ensuring that empathy is kind of key and it is not interfered with for boys, because I think so many things that happen in the socialization of boys are about eroding empathy, breaking
Mhm.
it down.
Yeah. I think I read a statistic a while ago, which was that they were saying that over 80% of men that they had interviewed, I think the sample was about 500, over 80% hadn't read any fiction in the past 5 years.
Mm,
And fiction is, the perfect opportunity to put yourself into the experience of someone else. So to have that experience of empathy through literature to, live in a different world. Whereas, when you look at the way books kind of used to be with great big sagas, your Lord of the Rings, your I don't know, your Jack Kerouac, your whoever, they were very much aimed at men reading them. But now the book talk, the book world that's out there is so skewed towards women.
mm,
Like I would be a big, big reader, and even I've noticed it that I'm trying to pick a new book and wading through all of this romance just to try and find a book that would be, really interesting to read. And it
yeah,
seems to be more, from my experience with it, it seems to be more if you're reading a book, it's going to be a history book, or it's going to be a book about war, or it's going to be a self-help book.
yeah,
These things that are being presented, which is just another way to essentially tell young men that they're not good enough. They need to improve themselves. They don't have as much glory because they haven't been to war. They're not as good as somebody else because they haven't made $1 million and run a marathon before breakfast.
mm,
It's these sorts of things that are, as you said, eroding kind of this ability to experience empathy. Instead, it becomes an envy situation of I don't have, therefore I'm not good enough.
yeah, absolutely. And even just this like polarization of gender, it's like going back to the toys, when I was a kid, it was much less
Mm,
polarized. And our clothes and our toys were much less gendered. They were much more kind of gender neutral. Um, but there's a whole period then where everything went, completely pink, blue, and this is like post-feminism. This happened. Um, and I think we're seeing like really extreme examples of that now with this kind of thing, men moving to the right in these big surveys and women drifting more to the left. Um, Fiction is now what a female art form. This crazy kind of stuff. It's quite alarming, really. And
mm,
the idea that fiction is, oh, it's just made up stories. And you're like, hang on a second, like the amount of research that somebody does to write a novel is probably equivalent to a PhD a lot of the time. Like it takes 2 or 3 years. It's an incredible amount of research. I would say that well over 50% of my understanding of the world comes from fiction.
mhm.
Well over. Um, and it's just but the point about empathy there is really interesting as well, that's another thing that fosters empathy is being able to identify with a character. And I had never really thought of it that way. That's yeah, it's very interesting.
Well, so I have a 5-year-old and I'm really interested in kind of, as you said, this whole idea of media literacy starting really young.
Mm.
Her school and her classmates, we've already talked about phones and when they have access to it, and everybody signed a little pact and what have you to try and minimize kind of keep it as long as possible before they have any sort of access to the internet. Um, oh, sorry, the chat's going. Sorry, Michelle, you're right. I will get to the comments in a sec. What I was going to ask is, who do you think is responsible for fostering, and holding the dialogues with kiddos? Do you think it's a combination? Do you think it's teachers? How can parents support that sort of stuff at home?
Yeah, I mean, this is really tricky. I think for a lot of people, the school parent dynamic and relationship isn't a simple one,
Mm,
and we all know that probably. So, you know, there's a school in Greystones, a primary school, that have done. I don't know if they were the originators I think they may have been, of It Takes a Village. And everybody's gotten on board. It's a primary school. It's fantastic. And everybody, pretty much everybody agreed about no mobile phones and, signed a contract or whatever. But Greystones is quite a, privileged, affluent town. And because it's quite an affluent town, there's quite a lot of parents where only one parent works. So other parents have a lot of time to get involved in these kinds of initiatives. And it's not necessarily a model that's easily replicated to schools in disadvantaged areas where, both parents are working all kinds of crazy hours, or, there may be single parents, or, all kinds of different kinds of family setups or whatever, under different kinds of pressures. And, for a lot of parents who are really struggling, social media, tablet screens are a really helpful way of keeping the kids occupied while you have to cook the dinners for the week or whatever it might be. So it's more difficult in different social situations, I think, to get on board with something like that. It's a great idea. You like anything, if you want to change people's thinking on something, you have to show them what are the benefits for them. And but sometimes just even getting them, to come into the school is really hard.
Mm.
So teacher parent relationships are difficult. And then you'll have loads of parents who believe that the school isn't doing enough and they want to get more involved. So, it's a really, really tricky one. Like, whose responsibility is this? And teachers that we talk to are so overwhelmed with, you've got to teach them about critical digital literacy. They don't really necessarily know how to do that themselves because they weren't taught that in teacher training college. You've got to teach them about porn literacy. They're like, no way. Terrified. You've got to teach them about, proper sex education, but they haven't been trained. So of course they're terrified to do that because that could go so pear-shaped so quickly. So, there's a huge amount of pressure put on teachers. They're not being trained enough. They're not trained enough in university, then they're not given enough continuous professional development training or support to do all these things. Parents are saying, like, we can't do this. We're not trained to do this. We're working every hour that there is in the day. So whose responsibility is it? Exactly. So it has to surely be social, collective social responsibility, and surely government has to lead on these kinds of solutions in an ideal world, right? Um, yeah, these are really big, important questions. Do we just ban mobile phones? Is that really going to solve the problem? Banning things doesn't usually help. We really have to educate, but we never start early enough with the educational interventions, etc., etc. So there's just like kind of multiple problems. We have to get the social media companies under control. How do we do that when, they're bringing so much money into the country and there's no real political will to
Yeah.
hold them to account because, the focus there is economic.
Hmm. Well, I think I'm just looking through the comment series. I'll have to just give me a little bit of grace because I'm trying to, it's my first one, so I'm just trying to make sure we get everybody heard. And before we go into listening to anybody in the comments, I think a lot of or sorry, anybody who wants to ask a question, a lot of the comments here are about kind of government policy in schools, so it could be a really good point to go through them. So John has said that there's the Australian government made internet access not permitted at all below a certain age. It was under 16. Um, and kind of asking if we agree with that sort of measure. Um, there was one of the creators of Adolescent actually called for radical action, um, and then wanted to ban social media for under 16s like Australia.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that sort of ban? Obviously, you've just kind of touched on it there, but do you think that those bans are helpful, or do you think maybe that they might be increasing the amount of loneliness and isolation that young teens are experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, the consensus among academics and researchers who work in this space in Australia as well is that the ban wasn't a good idea.
Mm,
Um, Not necessarily because we don't need to put a brake on this stuff, we absolutely do. Um, but it's just like, how do you implement it? It was a kind of knee-jerk reaction. It wasn't thought through in terms of like this actually is going to be really difficult to implement,
mm,
because kids can circumvent age verification, they can get hold of phones really easily, etc., etc. Um, the other thing is as well that, for a lot of kids who are maybe neurodivergent or teens questioning their sexuality or whatever, or kids who just feel a bit different, the online world can be a kind of lifeline to them.
mm,
Uh, and I suppose, the other big criticism is that it's letting the social media companies off the hook. So, they're kind of delighted in some ways. I mean, obviously, in other ways, they're not, because children are a massive market for them. But it
yeah,
means that they feel freer if this was to be a blanket solution. Um, so that it's not actually saying to them, you have actual responsibilities to children. Um,
yeah,
and they love, I mean, in many ways, they love all the educational um, responses as well, because they're like, oh yeah, education, that takes years, that takes decades. Where they're just looking at the next, you know, profit
hmm
profit sheets. It's all about money to them, and it's all very short term. So yes and no. I think what the schools are doing by having the kids push the phones away for the day is having a positive impact. Certainly what we're hearing back from them is, yes, the kids seem happier. Um, so that's certainly working. It doesn't solve
yeah,
the problem in that they're going to go online, but at least they've had a mental break from it for the whole day. And they're saying that there's less bullying, they're saying that there's less anxiety, that they feel a bit freer. I mean, of course, they run home and get back on all the chats and catch up on the gossip. But yeah, I don't know. I think in many ways the jury's out on the what the solution is. But banning things doesn't usually work well. I think we know
no,
that from history.
exactly. Oisin made a good
It's
point
not to
here.
say,
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, go on, go on. I
Oh,
don't
I was
want to
saying,
take up all your
Oisin in the
time.
comments here made a good point that he has teenage boys and gave the younger one a dumb phone that has no access to social media. So those, I think, especially for younger kids, are a great alternative to start them with, learning how to be responsible on.
100%. Yeah,
And then
100%.
I'll just do a couple of comments and then we have some people with hands up, so we'll go to them in a moment. Michelle is saying that the humanist angle is how religious control of our schools stops effective. I think the humanist angle is how religious control of our schools stops effective relationships and sexual education taking place. I might ask you, Michelle, in a minute to talk me through that one if that's okay. I don't think I'm reading it right. My brain's gone a bit mad. But media literacy in schools is, key. I think I certainly remember when I was in school, there was a box computer in the corner, and as far as I know, that hasn't really gone too much further from then. And then
Yeah, no, Michelle's point is absolutely right. I think that the religious ethos, or even just like the kind of hangover of religious culture in schools, makes it very kind of, schools are very scared and very reluctant to talk openly about sex, and teachers are terrified and they need training. And so, yeah, it has created in Ireland a particular void, I think. Owen Cleary talks about this too. And
yeah,
that's another reason why kids have turned so much to pornography for their education, because,
yeah,
they've just gone from one like kind of extreme regime of silence to the other end of the spectrum, if you like. Having said that, sex education is better in a lot of European countries, but it's still not perfect. There's
yeah.
there's still a lot of deficits in a lot of the programs.
Right. There's an interesting conversation. I'll just do a couple more comments that are quite relevant, and then Hugh, I'll come to you. Um, so we were seeing that John is saying that he's read how even if the online content itself is positive or harmless, it's still unhealthy for us to be kind of attached to our phones so much throughout the day because it's so unnatural for us. We haven't evolved to have so much screen time. And then
Mm.
Dominic again is saying, is there any direct correlation between the rise of anxiety in children and the use of their smartphone? There is. I couldn't quote it off the top of my head, Dominic, but I have seen that research that yes, it very much is the case that children who have access to smartphones tend to experience more anxiety and, psychological harm. But I
And then
think
you
that
have these other studies that counter that. And this is where you really need to get to, like you're looking at all these completely, it's like the harms of pornography, all these studies that show it's harmless, it's fantasy, all these other studies that show it's really harmful. And the devil is always in the detail. It's like, how do you define it? Who did you interview? How did you recruit them? What did you ask them? What methods did you use? How did you analyze the data? And you'll find that it's all completely different and therefore, leads to different findings. So yeah, I mean, who has time as well? Like we barely have time. This is our job to
fair,
get down
fair.
into the detail of this. So, you know, it's that one is really tricky. But I mean, certainly I do think that it increases levels of anxiety, and anecdotally, my daughters would have said that, yeah, it had a huge impact on their sense of self-esteem and constant comparison and checking themselves, their body image, all
Mhm.
of that kind of stuff. That, it's a huge source of anxiety. But, at the same time, they kind of grew up with it and with the phones. So, and we
Mm.
were, we were the generation who didn't, was the Wild West. We'd no idea. Like they had us believe that to be policing them or checking their phones was like an invasion of their privacy. It was like reading their diary. So we were like, oh God, okay, yeah, no, we better not do that. And okay, it wasn't as bad, the internet then, thank God. But yeah, it's kind of scary to think that, it just all happened so quickly, and it seemed like everything that they were doing online was quite innocent. Um, but yeah, I mean, as somebody said, even that amount of time online is not good, no matter
Mhm.
what you're watching.
Yeah, no, 100%. All right, let's move up. So I think we're getting over here. So we've got three. So we'll go in the line that they're up here. So Hugh, I think your hand was up first. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Debbie. Uh, an interesting conversation, but I think can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
it. I think what has happened is we have moved very much from the manosphere and in the incel culture, which I believe is a very small proportion of the population and the way the population is going. If I think back to the conversations about uh, what De Valera had, his idea of Ireland was comely maidens and dancing, jiving at the crossroads and all that sort of stuff. That 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 is what we are at now, if you like, in terms of the division between males and females and where the males should be and where the female should be. And even in our constitution, we have this problem. But in terms of uh, the development of young people today, it needs to be in the family, and it needs to be connections in the family, and kids need to have be allowed to critically think
Mm,
rather than be fed their education. The,
mm,
that that normal thing in kids is, why is this happening and how is that, and so on. That should be allowed to continue right through their lives. And in this way, then they can learn from people who have their interests at heart as to what the way of life should be. It, we, the problem with now is that we are conflating, or we are inflating all of the bad things that are happening from the internet. And we are inflating these so that they're being propagated all over the place instead of nurturing kids and having the connections in the family, nurturing by example, and allowing them the actual critical thinking. And we shouldn't be dependent on the government to do anything in this area, except control maybe the worst aspects of it. And the other thing that has concerned me for a long time is the domestic violence within our society and the inability of females, particularly, to be able to move out of their situations. And that's why I've been trying to promote the idea of universal basic income, so that every adult would have an income, and it would allow anyone in the net or in the community to move out of that community because they have the financial ability to do it. But they're my comments on what has been said. But I think we have moved very far away from what the topic I thought I was going to hear about, to a very broad discussion on the effect of the internet on kids and on communities at present, because these things will take their process, but the real strength is in the families and the communities, and it's supporting the families and the communities to be able to allow kids to be themselves. And I don't know what era you grew up in, Debbie, but I can remember, and I'm maybe a year or two older than you, but I can remember that kids' toys were, the girls always got dolls and the boys got tractors or whatever else it was. So there was always that split in terms of male and female toys. Okay.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Here, I think you have some really good points there about it going back to being in the family. I think that's kind of where we've touched on it as well, haven't we? Where, giving kids the opportunity to learn that empathy and learn that sort of thing in a safe environment at home is really good.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and of course, there's always been like kind of sexist, gender-based division in those things. I grew up in the 70s, though, so there was there definitely was a more I would say gender neutral environment in many ways. But yeah, I mean the fact, I mean, I'm only answering obviously Megan's questions, so yeah, I wouldn't say that the manosphere though I wouldn't necessarily agree with you, Hugh, that it's going from something that's like very niche or very, a minority of people, and then we're, going out to talk much broader. I mean, the whole reason I suppose we're having this conversation and that it's come to public attention and media attention is because it's impacting so many young people and that it has become so mainstream. And, I suppose the real danger is if it's not the manosphere, it's conspiracy theories. And if it's not conspiracy theories, it's the far right. And they're telling us that they're getting a huge amount of anti-immigration stuff in their feed. 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old boys now. Massive amounts of localized Irish anti-immigration content. Conor McGregor as well, a lot. But all of the American and British influence. So this is something that's affecting like all our boys. It doesn't mean that they all accept those messages. Like lots of them are like, no, I don't, I try to retrain my algorithm or I don't look at that stuff or whatever. And we think that those guys are fools. So Sure, not everybody is being indoctrinated, but it is something that's affecting them. And the kind of availability of misogynistic porn that's associated with the manosphere is something that features in all their lives. So I do think it is a broader kind of general social problem,
Yeah.
for sure. Unfortunately.
So we have
Can I
comments.
just say two things then? And this is where respect comes in,
Mm,
empathy, and where people are taught to be critical thinkers. We have
mm,
killed a lot of the critical thinking. In
absolutely.
if you talk against the government even in this country, you're seen as somebody who's not acceptable. You haven't followed the norm. You haven't followed the so I mean the election of our president is a blow, I think, for critical thinking. And I think it's a point of change that we could follow on to. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, you. Now, let's have a look. So we had a comment from John saying, I think the conversation became focused on children being safe online because they're most vulnerable and potential victims of toxic masculinity online, which is pretty much exactly where, especially for me, as I have a young child, that's what I'm interested in, I have to say. So I think let's mosey on with hands up. Patrick, Michelle, and Sean, you've been very patient. Patrick, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi guys, and Debbie and Megan, thank you both for a very interesting discussion. And it's very difficult to know how ordinary people like ourselves can do anything to counter this appeal of incel and online hate forums. And I mean, can I ask you both, because Megan, you're in this field and in this space as well, I understand from your research. What do you think is the single most effective thing that would counter the appeal of incel and these hate-based on online spaces, and how to do that without feeding these voices and giving them more, I suppose, fuel and adding more fuel to their argument?
Is that a question for me, Patrick, or for Megan?
Both of you.
Oh, sorry.
I'd be interested. I'd be interested in Megan's view as well.
Um, so Debbie, if you, I would essentially say with my little one, what we've been focusing on is, fostering kindness at home.
Mm.
So working towards, looking at people and trying to see the world from their perspective is really, really important for us. We do a lot of work with people of different cultures. We try and include people of all different backgrounds in our life as much as possible to kind of demonstrate that for her, but also she doesn't really get access to screens or anything because I'm so aware of what's out there. I think we've kind of mentioned it before that like kindness and empathy are the driving force behind not being sucked into that, in my opinion. What would you say, Debbie?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think with you know, with boys in particular who are becoming pulled into these very extreme cultures and very hateful kind of cultures, um, we have to try and understand what the attraction is and what void or emptiness, like what is that filling? And it's less interesting to talk about the actual content, I suppose, of that stuff that they're consuming than it is to ask them what's going on in your life. Like, why do you need this stuff? Why do you think this guy's cool or that guy has some kind of message for you? Um, like, what's it fulfilling? And what are the anxieties and the vulnerabilities that they're tapping into? And it's just like kind of, we can't expect them to come up with the answers. We have to look out for them and we have to make sure they're okay and just keep checking in with them. And sometimes that's really hard because they don't want to be, they certainly don't want to be quizzed. They have to come to us. But it's creating those spaces where I suppose they don't feel judged, where you're showing, look, I am concerned, but I'm not being alarmist. I am concerned for you because I love you. And if you want to talk to me at any point about not this stuff, but the reason why you're attracted to it or why you feel it fulfills some need, then I'm here for you, you know, and to try and open up that space where they come to the conversation first. We can't be telling them. I mean, the worst possible reaction is, don't watch that. This is horrific. He's misogynist. That's toxic. That's racist. They're so sick of hearing this because they think, oh, you just don't understand. You just, so, you know, we have to kind of meet them where they are. And sometimes that's really hard because obviously you really disagree with the stuff that they're watching. But we have a different understanding of that. We have a deep understanding of the backstories of racism and misogyny and the whole history of civil rights, etc. And we are offended. I'm not saying that this content is not problematic. It's massively problematic. We're offended by this content for all the right reasons. But a 14-year-old mightn't be because they don't really understand the full, you know, impact, significance of this. For them, it's a way of gaining popularity sometimes with their mates, or it's a way of being a bit rebellious. And every generation has its, you know, signifiers of that. This, I do think, is much more significant and much more problematic. You know, a lot of these influences are in cahoots with the Trumps, the Elon Musks, and, you know, the tech oligarchs. They have a vision for society that is quite ominous. So, you know, we have to look at that broader political picture. But I think we have to try and meet boys and men where they're at and say, okay, tell me where you're at. Tell me why it is. And just make sure that, you know, that we're kind of there for them, while at the same time stepping up the legal, you know, legal change and legislation about image-based sexual abuse and all of those other things, online hate, and trying to put pressure on the tech companies. So it has to be multifaceted, and it has to, you know, it's education, it's family, it's the home, it's legal, it's platform governance. You know, it's a multifaceted approach because no one thing can tackle something that is just so, you know, omnipresent in our lives. Don't forget, you know, you sometimes you're giving out to your teenagers or your kids about this, but like we're online all the time as well, and we're on our phones, and you know, we're using our phones for online banking, and we're using our phones for, you know, driving from A to B. So it's not like we're not on our phones either, but it's we're on them probably for very different uses. So it's trying to create environments of digital safety, not just safety, but digital health, I suppose. That you could think of it in terms of digital health. Um, but you know, I suppose this is the first generation of society trying to deal with this, and the speed of change is just too much for all of those systems and structures to catch up with. It's also too much for our brains to catch up with. Somebody said earlier that you know, we're not like really able to process this number of connections and friends. And then you say, you know, I've forgotten that person's name. Am I losing it? And you're like, no, because like humans are not used to having 1,000 connections on each platform or 500 friends, or you know, we have too much connection with too many people at all times. We're just not programmed to have that many acquaintances and contacts. So, you know,
I
anyway,
think
I don't know if that's an answer, Patrick.
no, that's fair enough. I think we have two hands up, and then I think we'll call it a night because we're. I saw your lights go off there on you, so I think they might be telling you to get to leave.
They're probably trying to kick me out.
So we'll just quickly hear
My
from
phone
Michelle.
battery,
Oh yeah,
if my phone battery goes, then it'll stop hotspotting to my laptop. So if I'm cut off, I'm sorry.
that's fair enough. Well, let's hear from Michelle and Sean, and then we can say our thank yous and our goodbyes. Michelle, you are muted. What I might do is, if it's not working for you, do you want to type your comment, and we can move to Sean. Sean, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Megan and Debbie. earlier in the talk, you mentioned about men moving to the right and women moving to the left. And that's something I know about, and I'm very embedded in leftist politics, but I don't really understand why that's happening. It seems like, I suppose, a tactical success of the right and a tactical failure at the left. And I just wonder, why do you think that's happening, and what do you think the left can do to solve that problem?
Wow. A great question. And I don't know the reasons actually that that report was done by King's College, I think, in London. It was reported widely in the Financial Times last year, maybe. And it was a really large scale study. So or maybe it was, yeah, Financial Times, I think. Um, so it does show very worrying trends. I'm not sure that it gives explanations. Um, Again, I think it goes back to the fact that I think as men grow older, their friendship networks often dwindle. They may sometimes, depend on wives or girlfriends to kind of organize the social life or whatever. Um, they're not socially conditioned to check in with each other. I mean, I think obviously this is changing, but men can become more, I suppose, emotionally isolated. And as soon as you're more emotionally isolated, I think you're more vulnerable to this type of messaging. And I guess that's one of the reasons. Economics is another, neoliberal economics and the kind of erosion of the social safety net. Precarious employment has become the norm for so many men. They feel they'll never own a house. Those things are kind of signifiers of traditional masculinity. So, you know, I think these things breed a lot of insecurity and anxiety that is also very easy to tap into. And if you're feeling economically vulnerable, it's very easy. I mean, we know this from history for the far right to sweep in and say, Western civilization is under attack. You're never going to own your own house. You're never going to get a wife because of that. And, preying on all these insecurities and blaming, of course, feminism and immigrants instead of neoliberal capitalism and the rising gap between rich and poor. So it's like, billionaires saying, look over there, it's their fault. It's immigrants' fault. It's the people who live in tents are causing your economic insecurity, not us billionaires owning the, vast amounts of wealth. So I don't know if I could blame the left, really. I just think you're probably right, though, about it's certainly a coup for the far right, 100%. But what can we do? What can the left do? I mean, that is the perennial question. We have to keep fighting fascism. We have to keep fighting anti-immigration rhetoric. Look, what's happening in the UK is going to start happening here at larger scale. So, but we need a government that will back that. Current constellation isn't doing that. So, we need to elect in politicians who will fight fascism basically and fight anti-immigration rhetoric, I suppose, at a very pragmatic level, and to ensure, um, again, we go back to empathy over and over again. I do all the time. It's very difficult to hate people if you have empathy, and it's very difficult to blame whole groups of people because the necessary dehumanization that has to happen, it's very difficult to do that if you have empathy at scale. And this is why the likes of Elon Musk say that empathy is the big enemy of Western civilization, because they see that as is what has allowed the left to welcome diversity. So they get it. They get it. They get why empathy is such a strong force. And if they think it's a really strong force, then they feel threatened by it, and they feel threatened by academia, which they do, and they feel threatened by NGOs. Well, then we should take. I think we should we should listen to that and say, well, if they feel threatened by us, then they must see us as a force. So let's like step up to the mark and be a force and fight them as much as we can. And I think we're joining forces with NGOs much more than we used to in the past. It's almost like a instinctive response to what's happening. So, you know, all of those things, I don't have any magic answers except for like, you know, smash capitalism, smash patriarchy, get rid of fascists. I wish it were so easy. But, you know, we do have to keep those goals in our sights, I think. Megan, you're on mute.
Oh my God, I'm chatting away, excuse me. That's probably a really good point to bring it to a close, because we've brought it back around to the fact that I think the humanist perspective of empathy and compassion is much more powerful than we give it credit for. And I think it is, you know, something that we can use to leverage against these sorts of things. Now, normally, Michael, when he does these chats, he will open the floor for the final comment to you. For anything that you want to say or promote, or, you know, what kind of outro you want to give it. I think we should continue that trend. So please, over to you. You want to end it?
To me.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, I'd just love to say thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry now I look like I'm in some kind of a horror movie because they've turned the lights off in here. Thanks for having me, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to such an engaged group, and everybody's like so obviously on board with, you know, ideas like empathy and philosophical principles of humanism. I do think they are the key to fostering progressive, inclusive communities at heart. We can't keep tackling individual issues because they'll keep coming up. The manosphere, conspiracy theories, Trump, you know, at every turn there'll be a new AI is going to throw up horrific things. And we can't keep focusing solely on these phenomena. We have to think big, and we have to think holistic, and we have to, you know, to start early and think conceptually. You don't have to talk to kids about influencers or sex education or, you know, sexual consent or any of these things. You talk to them about basic consent, bodily autonomy, respect for one another from a young age. And you don't disconnect them from nature and from the love of animals and from kindness. And you don't tell them not to cry or express their feelings. You're going to have people who can deal with all of this other stuff, because it's just going to keep throwing up more and more stuff. And I think sometimes we get fixated on the thing rather than going back to the kind of philosophical humanist principles that we need to instill. And, you know, there's a lot of work to be done because our education system is not founded on those principles. It's founded on very different principles of kind of filling a bucket or hierarchical, top down. And we need to start a kind of grassroots revolution in education where it's bottom up, co-creation, co-education, and give people the tools for critical inquiry that they need.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, and please keep in touch. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Kermagat.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.